All right, so those of you who are super secretive, now is the time to bounce out of the meeting. Otherwise, you're stuck here with us for the next hour. Your computer will not allow you to leave, no matter how hard you try. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, David. Great to be here with all of you. I appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas, ones I've been working on for a long time, both as an academic and in the field, trying to work on change. And it's nice to just see all of you out there, as I know partners in a similar mission. What David just presented, coincides quite a bit with the work I do, and the purpose of We All. There's a reason I came across We All is because of the alignment. So I'm going to talk about the systems change aspect of our work. And I think the way Dev and I talked before the presentation, I will present maybe, let's say roughly like 7-8 slides, and then I'm going to stop and just see what your ideas are in relation to this. I welcome feedback, anything that you feel might be missing, or other ways to look at what I'm talking about. So we'll do that. We'll do that a few times during this. So we'll kind of mix it up, so you don't just have to listen to me speak for a long time. Let's see here. So a little bit about myself, and just a quick check. Everybody can see it okay? Okay. There I am a couple decades ago, backpacking, something I do a lot. This is where it kind of started for me. Out of college, had a lengthy backpacking experience. In college, quite a while ago, I was learned about environmental problems, but they were abstract. I didn't really feel it. And when I got out in the wilderness for extended periods of time, it became much deeper in my system. And I really, ever since then, my career's had a lot to do with environment sustainability. I was actually worked in public schools for 17 years, but I did a lot of environment sustainability work there. Eventually decided I wanted to focus completely on societal change. So I went back and did research, and this was my lengthy dissertation title that I completed mid-career. And the things you can kind of see, I mean, first of all, the behavior focus. So a lot of my thinking, the work I do, is how do we as humans behave, and what does that mean for the state of our environment, the state of our communities, etc. But specifically in this work the research that I did, and kind of what's leading to the presentation you're going to see, is I did look at specific things that influence people's choices. And I focused on transportation. I still do quite a bit on transportation because it is, certainly in California, but also across the country, the largest, climate emissions contributor for the average person. And so the self-interest piece was one thing. And I really, found in my research the important role of self-interest, but it also led me to a larger look at what is very much aligned with We All. It's probably, similar, the collective well-being idea. How can we align personal, social, and environmental well-being together? How can we can encourage living in such ways? But perhaps the most important piece was the conditions part. What are the conditions that influence our choices? In this particular research, I looked a lot at physical conditions, social conditions, cultural conditions. And that's led over it's been about 8 years since I did this. I've been consulting ever since and doing other writing and so forth, to focusing on systems change. Because really, to move the needle, as you probably all know, on changing our physical environment, our culture, our social environment, we've got to change systems. It's not just stuff on the margins, right? And so that's what I've embraced. Over here on the left is actually, I work a lot as a consultant with collaboratives, and especially in the last couple of years, we've framed more and more that work around systems change. In fact, the exact framework I'm going to share with you today, I just was working with a group like this on safe routes to school and city school district teams that are trying to change how people get around in their cities, particularly young people. And so finally, it's kind of close to the title of the presentation, but I have been working on a book. I hope it's coming out next year. We'll see. But that's where I've tried to capture a lot of these ideas. So at the start, I welcomed your feedback. I'd love, to hear, what you think about some of these ideas, how it relates to what you do, and what might be different and so forth. So I got to start with why, what even got me involved, probably got you involved. I'm only gonna have one slide on the problems, really, at least in this sense. But this is out my window here in San Francisco. I'm here in San Francisco. I've been in the same place for 20 years. This was September 9th, 2020. When, I don't know if some of you are in the Bay Area, but this is the middle of the day and it looked like night, right? The wildfire, the smoke was so bad. We're experiencing all sorts of crises. There's lots of ways to look at it, right? But the poly crisis, some people refer to it. There's no one way to break it all down, but and every time you put things on categories, it limits our understanding. But to try to make sense of it, I look at like what's going on environmentally, societally, and then kind of at the individual level, the personal health level. We could spend a whole hour like kind of taking this all apart, and I'm sure there's things you might add to it, perhaps like a pandemic. But the fact is, and I don't want to say things too much that I know, I want to be familiar. The audience, I know you fairly well engaged on these issues, but they're all so interrelated, right? And just about every environmental crises cut right across systemic racism, the frontline communities who's most at harm across the globe and in the States. The social breakdown piece, something I spend quite a bit of time on, that everything from the loss of community life that's happening to polarization and just the divisions that have arisen, and how that kind of correlates to all this loneliness and stress that people are feeling, right? I don't know if you saw the Surgeon General's report, maybe it was last year, but 1 in 4 Americans are seriously lonely. It's definitely one of the many epidemics. So this is kind of a rough, dismal picture, but again, it. But what I want to suggest for this presentation and what I'm going to share is to think of the crises, and maybe you already do, is it's the symptoms. It's not what's necessarily happening underneath. And what I am kind of positing for your consideration and is that there's an underlying disease, right? And that disease is alienation from nature, local community, and people with different lived experiences. In other words, modern society has been more or less designed to create these separations. And you can kind of trace how this might directly lead to some of these problems. Like when there's not local community, it is more likely we're going to be lonely. It is more likely that deaths of despair from alcohol, drugs happen, suicide. When we're alienated from nature, maybe it's a little more indirect, but we don't have maybe the appreciation for biodiversity that we could have. It's something that's far removed and out there. So all of these things, I think, play. There's no one way to explain what's happening in society, but this is an angle I like to put up there. And of course, people with different lived experiences, it's hard to really understand economic inequality, and if we're living in such different places, and we know that we're divided that way quite a bit. So it's also, in essence, there's all these crises, but I'm gonna suggest that it's a crisis of how we live, and not that it's an individual choice, but it's a crisis of how society has shaped our lives, and that gets into the thinking about these relationships. So I'm kind of curious. This is kind of a new simple diagram. There is some research that has like the nature and self circles, so I've added place and community. But yeah, here, as we know, our society, a human society, almost the entire part of it to the last couple hundred years was very much place-based communities, communities generally of like 150 people. Over time, it grew into larger cities, of course. But there was a strong connection to nature, right where we live. We depended on community for our survival and thriving. And self was there, right? But this speaks to so many different philosophies, but certainly from like an indigenous perspective, self is just is not anything really by, it's just part, right? It's the whole is much bigger, and this is how society has been oriented. But today things are quite different. Okay, so this is maybe dramatic. Maybe it's not quite to this extent, but I'm curious how you kind of react to the placement of things here. I think there's definitely a tip to capitalism here, putting the self above everything else. I think that's pretty embedded in capitalism. But more importantly, perhaps, is just the separation that's happened, right? That nature in our daily lives is much less than it has been for most of human history. Community is absent in so many ways, and then this whole idea of connecting to place is something that is also kind of vanished, in the sense of it's almost like placelessness. Like we're all, we're global citizens. We can live on our computers. There's not this physical place is less of a thing in our lives, right? Let me, yeah. So the before I jump into it, I just want to like a couple more slides, and I want to kind of pause and get some of your thoughts on this. But this didn't just happen overnight, right? And so that some of the history certainly goes into colonialism. I'm sure you could find history before colonialism, but Barry Lopez kind of brings this to light. And for me, I don't know how much you're familiar with him, but he's one of the most incredible writers that I have ever read books from, and unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but just incredibly grounded in indigenous wisdom and just our connection to nature. And this is his depiction of what happened, right, when Columbus came across Guanahani, the first island that landed on. And this is not the history that probably many of us learned in school. And I know you're all well versed and understand that this is the more probably true, full history of what happened. But what I take from this passage here is, the removal of nature that started to happen in places where people live, scraped bare, and also just this complete separating people from the land that they knew, from the community, from their communities, all that transpired since Columbus arrived. With you add the slavery and pulling people from Africa, from their homeland, from their place. The roots of it were very strong. So like I said, we cannot see what Columbus saw. The fabric of animals and plants and people is utterly torn apart. So we have that kind of foundation, and then what does it look like today? And I think there is a line that connects all these things. We live in an era of corporate capitalism. David Corten wrote the book, I think it was maybe in the mid-90s, When Corporations Rule the World. Well, I think it's abundantly clear now that corporations do rule the world. What I focus on not so much is the amount of resources and the inequality and the corporate power structures, but it's how does this influence how we live? Going back to the main premise, what does corporate capitalism have to do with how we live? And there's like 4 buckets of kind of forces I think about a lot, and would argue that we need to really address. So car dependency, it's no accident that we drive so much. We're so dependent on cars. The auto industry, the oil industry, now the tech industry with AVs and rideshare and so forth, very powerful. Consumerism as a second bucket. Amazon's, put that in fast drive. Now we have hyper consumerism delivered to your doorstep. And then of course, digital society, right? Another big thing. We really think about what's pulling us away from community and pulling us away from each other. Time on screens, and I'm not, again, it happens to all of us. I'm not trying to, this is not about individuals. This is about our society. This is, I don't know if you've heard the term phubbing. This is phubbing, where you're sitting around with your friends or loved ones, but you're on your screens. And this all rests, of course, on a global economic structure, a global capitalist structure, where we can pull everything we need from technology to consumer goods to energy sources around the world in this incredibly complex system, where again corporations are the main beneficiaries. So the question for you, as we kind of take a pause here from a presentation, is what might happen if we move from corporate capitalism to place as the dominant influence on our systems and lives? Okay, and so I'm not not suggesting that it's a complete chain where there's no more corporations and all it is place-based. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting how do we kind of lean in that direction, move in that direction. And what we're going to get into is that would this lead to the regeneration we so desperately need of regenerating nature, so it's something that can sustain us and help us thrive, regenerating that community that has become more and more absent, and regenerating local wealth, getting it back to local businesses, regional businesses, and so forth, as opposed to multinational sources. So I presented a bit there. I'm going to dive into the systems change framework that I have and kind of how we might go about it. But let me, let's see, let me just stop for a moment and take questions, comments, something. Again, I welcome any sort of feedback, constructive, otherwise. You gotta unmute.
Going to explain what you mean by place later.
Yeah, I can talk more. Yeah, we can talk more about that. It's a good point to do that. I mean, certainly the physical aspect of it, that it is the physical context in which we live, and there's scales of it, right? So for me, I've got my neighborhood as part of my place. I've got the city of San Francisco as another layer of my place that I connect to. And then I would say I've got the Bay Area, kind of a region that I connect to as well. To some extent, a bioregion that, depending on how you want to look at it, you know, could extend all the way to the Sierras and the sources of water that come our way, and so forth. So there's the geographical aspect of it. I appreciate your question. There's also of course, the cultural aspect to a place, and it's knowing the people and the groups and the ways things that are done here, and the history of it, because unfortunately the history is kind of true to Barry Lopez, where a lot of it has at least the deep history has been erased or diminished substantially. So when I think about connecting to place, I am interested in, like, what was it like here when the local biodiversity thrived? What was it like when people who lived independent, you know, closely connected to that? What was that like? So we've got, and then, you know, so essentially the nature, the civilization, and then the different scales of place. Those are the things that I think about.
Matt, I was just gonna comment that, you know, we asked people when they signed up, who's your favorite teacher on systems change? And Donella Meadows was by far the biggest answer, but also Joanna Macy and Kate Rayworth, Nora Bateson. So my guess is everybody here seems pretty well versed in a lot of this already. So it's a great crowd. I mean, it's just so great that so many people have studied this. So
that's great. Yeah, and I like them. I like the people that you mentioned too. Definitely read Donella Meadows' work. What's different here is, I think her approach is fantastic and it offers so much. What I'm going to present is much more like on the ground. How do we make change now? It's how does we make change that influences how people live, right? It's not meant to be abstract. Systems change easily gets abstract. If I look at like the 20 tipping points that Meadows talks about, this is quite different than that. This is not, I'm not in tipping points. This is more about levers. This is more about what are the big things we need to pull and how do we pull them, basically.
awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back in there, but feel free to, you know, just speak up at any point. It's a small enough group. If there's something you'd like explained or you have a reaction to, just jump right in. Okay. All right, so the but the answer I'm going to put out there for you, right, is, you know, how do we, what might it look like if we move in this direction, and then how can we actually start moving in that direction? And I feel like there actually are a ton of initiatives that are moving in this direction, and I'll share a little bit about this. But essentially, this idea of place-based systems, right? Not corporate capitalist based, but place-based systems. I'm going to go kind of quickly through this list because I know these are ideas you're all familiar with, but again, this framing of systems change is grounded in our everyday realities, right? So we're going to talk clearly about the housing system, and if we're interested in being together and not having to be in our cars so much, and having community that's right outside our doorstep, you know, affordable, available housing, particularly for you know, there's so many people who can't afford to live where they work. It's addressing that in a big way. So the housing system, and then of course the work system, just that, you know, obviously opportunities to work in local business have been diminished. I mean, you look at anything, one thing I've written about recently is just the changes in bookstores, you know, Amazon and other online services just kind of decimated local bookstores. But there is a resurgence. There is quite, that is starting to come back more and more and stabilize a little bit. But how do we have a work system that gives more people opportunities to own businesses locally, more that local wealth, more that share of the economy, transportation, active community. I'm going to dive more into transportation as the example, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. But that's definitely everything aside from being in a car. And then that also speaks to what are the spaces that we have in our community to gather, outside, inside, you know, other ways that we can come together in person. And then of course, abundant nearby nature spaces, and that can really vary, and it often varies by zip code and how much income is in a community. A lot of lower income communities have, you know, the nature access has been limited, but there's a lot of groups working on that, right? So these 5 systems, again, nothing should be like I don't think anything is surprising there, but I frame those around. These are kind of going back to that idea of place. A lot of this can be very local. A lot of these needs can be met in your neighborhood, in your city, and maybe in your county, depending on your context, right? It doesn't mean it requires change at all levels. I mean, the federal government, the state governments, I mean, helping with their resources to make this happen is really important, and policies and so forth. But this is kind of that more local part of place. Then there's 3 other systems. There's basically 8 systems that I kind of wrap around and suggest are the most important ones for us to change when it comes to environmental and social outcomes. So the other 3 are more at the regional level: regional food sheds, regional energy sheds, and then this one's kind of a combination. It's consumer goods, but it's making sheds, fiber sheds, and circular economy. So you hear this word sheds, there's not a whole lot written on the shed concept, right? It comes from, of course, watersheds, and just the idea that we could try to source more and more, maybe eventually all of our food, our energy, and our consumer goods from within our regions. And I would argue that these are the kind of things to push for, because it dramatically shifts our relationship to nature and each other. You know, it's the fact that we've depleted so much nature, and it's no accident, right? That it's because it's so much of what we consume is not connected to what it's actually coming from, right? And so this is just about local, bringing things closer. We're going to protect what we know. And, you know, when we know it, hopefully we're going to love it. And I see encouraging things.
God.
Oh, I think that's not a question. Okay, so think of like
Hello.
the place-based systems,
Hello.
kind of the.
Good.
Oh,
I'm on a.
someone needs to mute. There we go. Think of this is kind of the goal. Like and I kind of glossed over, of course, this is all because how much our behavior depends on our context, and that it's not about individual desire. I found that in my research again and again. People who cared about climate change the most did not correlate with living more environmentally sustainable lives. It was much more about their context. So the idea that this place-based systems could shift our lives back into a more meaningful relationship with our places. You know, the thing we talked about, everything from neighborhood up to your regions. And that once again, you know, kind of, it's not that we're going back in time, but we're going back to some of the parts that helped us sustain humanity for so long. So what about, this is an important part of the equation when we're thinking about the kind of change is, well, okay, that's great back here, but this, you know, people are very self-interested. It's in our nature. And if it's just about contributing to community and so forth, how are we going to actually motivate people? Again, you may be familiar, you're certainly familiar with this research as from the well-being perspective. So I'm wanting to spend a few seconds really here. I do love that. It's one of my favorite pictures of being in nature, being with each other. But all that research, you know, I mean, social, community, and nature connection is so important. The amount of literature on the value of nature to our physical, emotional, cognitive health is just kind of off the charts now. I think we intuitively know it. It's nice to see it validated by research. And so our health is certainly important. You know, financial security, we could talk about that too, but I would argue that not being dependent on corporations that are focused on quarterly profit growth and cost cutting, you know, does not necessarily contribute to our financial security as much as things that would be more rooted in our cities and regions and so forth. And then just that purpose, you know, trying to find that purpose in our lives. And when it's right in front of us, when we're connected to it, it can be a lot more meaningful. So, you know, this is from a lot of different research I've looked at. And I do like to point out, one of the things I love is just, and I don't always follow this, I'll say, but I try, that the happiest people, you know, watch TV less than an hour a day or digital entertainment, right? So I mean, the point, of course, is just being connected to the real physical world is really beneficial to ourselves. And the narrative in society does not tell us that right now, but I know you're all invested in changing that narrative. So I agree very much with Raymond Young, who influenced a lot of my research. Great professor in Michigan. If you ever come across any of his articles, I highly recommend reading them. But he just very simply says, you know, we're heading down a decline here for sure. But if we can actually forge a better life, an enjoyable life, and I full-heartedly believe that if we do it right. So what's getting in the way? And this kind of starts to get into this framework a little bit more. What exactly is the status quo, and how? This is one way to kind of start to look at it. Is one, you know, obviously power structures get in the way, and the hard part about it is that power definitely hides in the shadows. It's not going to just jump out at us a lot, right? Why did transit projects in Nashville, Tennessee, and Little Rock, Arkansas, these big transit projects, why did they get defeated? Well, the Koch brothers put a huge amount of money into that, because the Koch brothers invest, you know, their money in cars and oil and so forth, and that's, you know, that's power kind of hiding in the shadows. There's so many. I mean, that was exposed, so it's out of the shadows, but there's that. We know that goes on so much, right? And then what about, you know, the cultural status quo? The inertia around our culture is tough, but it's the old saying, you know, how it goes unnoticed, that we're, you know, as the metaphor of being fish in the water and not seeing the context and what's around us. And it's unless you're really thinking about it a lot, which I know you guys are, it's hard to think, you know, well, this is what our culture is doing. This is what our culture values. We value convenience more than we value relationships. It's more important that something gets to us fast than, you know, it's all those kind of cultural values that we don't necessarily surface a lot. And then land use, right? We talk about there's no, you know, that we're suburbanized across America. There's no way that we're ever gonna change our transportation habits, or we're gonna have different, you know, community amenities and so forth. And so that kind of presents itself too. And then we want to change things, but and there's just great efforts. San Francisco is a great example. There's just unbelievable amount of nonprofits and places doing it, but we're often kind of working separately, not coming together. And in that sense, you could say, very directed to kind of build power to overcome some of the status quo, right? So these four status quo forces: power, culture, land use, and silos, right? I would argue are definitely kind of holding in place and worsening our problems, and they're really kind of standing in the way of building place-based systems that would change how we live. And again, if you agree with the argument that we do need to change our ways of living if we really want to get to the depth of our crises, that alienation that I talked about earlier. So the systems change levers, it's going to be pretty clear where these are coming from then, is how do we shift these conditions that have shaped society and how we live? We clearly need to shift power. We need to work on resetting culture. We need to transform land use. And we need to leverage systems together, right? We need to do as much as we can to link. I mentioned some of those systems earlier, but clearly there's a lot of links between housing and transportation, and really, work and workplaces. So that's one obvious one, but there's a lot. The more you explore it, there's a lot of other linkages we can do. I mean, I was just facilitating workshops this morning for safe routes to school, and that's a great example of linking the education system with the transportation system to make change. And I see a lot of powerful things coming out of that. So this is the large framework, right? Let's get into some of the details. And I think, David, what do you think? I can go into more detailed examples of how this framework manifests itself, or we could pause.
Yeah, I would say that based on the people that I know that are here, hearing specific examples, because you've done this in multiple locations,
Yep.
and understanding how you apply the whole framework you just explained in a specific place base would be my guess is what people are most interested in, but people are free to disagree.
Right. Good. Okay. I think what I'll do based on that comment, so this is transportation system. It might be still to a little bit of a higher level than you want. And I'm looking at the time. So I think what I'll do is I'll go way down to on the ground, if that's helpful. I can use an on the ground example in San Francisco of applying this framework. Is that?
I think that's what this audience is most
Okay.
interested in. And if anyone disagrees, feel free to speak up or put something in the chat.
Sounds good. Okay. So I didn't check. I don't know if how many of you, I don't know if anybody else is from San Francisco perhaps, or at least like the Bay Area, but maybe you've heard about this. It's called the JFK Promenade. And I'll kind of show you, this is a little bit of, I did some research on it, and I know a lot of the organizations involved. But essentially, this article was in the Congress for New Urbanism after I wrote it up. But it was a 1.5 mile street that was transformed in San Francisco to different purposes. All right. So, and I didn't, there was a whole bunch of points here, but this is, okay, so here's the land use piece, and we'll talk about each of the levers and how they were applied, right? So this is a major thoroughfare through Golden Gate Park, a lot of car traffic historically. And during the pandemic, as you all remember, right, a lot of streets and stuff were altered to provide more space for people, and this was one of them. And not only, though, it wasn't just like, let's close off the street, but let's actually change it. Let's make it clear that this physical space might have other purposes than just moving vehicles. So there were sitting areas, right? Music stages, lots of art, the murals, the sculptures. Way in the distance there is a tail of a whale. Children's book walks, or something for for kids. There's a beer garden, something for the adults. That was a little later. That wasn't the height of the pandemic. This obviously came out when it was safer. And just a whole lot of space for walking, biking, skating. And then there's a lot of improvements for accessibility, so people who were less abled could get there easily. There's parking was strategically placed near it, but a lot of people came at other means. So this was a I wouldn't call this like a grand transformation of land use, across the city by any means, but it was a big transformation for a mile and a half of real estate. But perhaps, on top of that, and very much related, but still distinct, was the cultural reset that happened. People started to look at this with a different attitude, with a different understanding, and started to develop different behaviors around how they were getting around and what they were doing in this public space. Right. So you see quotes. I interviewed the executive directors of the organizations that worked on this. Just the observations that this is, people were sitting playing piano, that kids could learn to ride a bike and parents weren't worried, which was a disappearing thing here, and it's very hard to find. As someone who's raised kids in San Francisco, I certainly appreciate that. This idea of it becoming a playground, a street, a playground, right? And then that the fact, I think the last quote is really interesting, right? Because that kind of I think it gets into something I would have talked about in the transportation system, but the importance of, when we're being strategic about change that we want to see, is giving people an opportunity to experience it, right? Because and like, as she said there, right, before it was just kind of a vision. Well, yeah, that sounds kind of good, but I'm not really sure it's worth it. Or what about just, okay, we're going to try this for a period of time. And the culture actually really started to shift very abruptly with that. So the third element, right, the power piece, okay, and a lot of times these organizations had worked separately, particularly the Bike Coalition and Walk San Francisco, two big advocacy organizations. And here's the Bike Coalition director saying that this wasn't about just being a special interest. This was about all of our different interests intersecting here. Kid Safe SF was the new kid on the block, so to speak. Pretty brand new organization that brought a lot of energy to this. They all played distinct roles in how they went about this. Also, the city government, Rec and Park, became very supportive of this. A lot of the changes I mentioned in the previous slides was because Rec and Park put their resources into it and went after it. And even like the transit agency, there's a lot of pushback that, wait a minute, this is Golden Gate Park, and there's communities that are far removed from San Francisco that have to drive there to get to Golden Gate Park, so you're taking away their access and so the local MTA increased transit service to Golden Gate Park at this time to try to address that concern. So a lot of strategic work here going together. November 2022, voters approved this by 63%, pretty big margin in San Francisco. But perhaps more importantly, and this gets into the transformation quality of where you start. Maybe you could say this is kind of a critical tipping point that started to happen here. But in just a month later, the city of San Francisco approved a network of permanent slow streets. And if I'd done through the transportation, a lot of you may be familiar with slow streets, but essentially they're shut off to anything but local residents who live on those streets, from cars, that is, but they're really kind of considered community spaces, and they've become avenues for biking and walking across the city, especially they're more connected. So this led to they were temporary during the pandemic, but because people said we love JFK Promenade, they also approved all these slow streets permanently. And then the city, more importantly, committed to a goal of a 100-mile network. There's still a lot of work to go on there, but there was a commitment that came out, and definitely a nod to equity. So this kind of, bringing these three levers together, right? We've got the land use, the culture, and the power working together and feeding off of each other in interesting ways. But we've also leveraged multiple systems there in yellow, okay? Because I do separate these things because they often have discrete support systems and government agencies and so forth. So one is just like public space, public works. One is transportation as part of the transportation network here. And another was definitely youth recreation. Going back to, this is a great place for kids to safely play and recreate and bike and so forth. A new story for San Francisco kind of came out of this, and the kind of the Golden Gate Park, the keeper of San Francisco story, is one of the leaders here says, But in this picture, celebrating the JFK Promenade and the Slow Streets approval, you've got the mayor of San Francisco, you've got the state senator, you've got some other supervisors. You know, the zeitgeist had shifted. You know, we know politicians will follow where the interest is. This is clearly where the interest was. And yeah, so that's kind of that story. I'm going to wrap up by just saying that an important layer of this is not just the levers, pulling the levers, but it's like how do we pull the levers? Who needs to pull these levers? And place-based collaboration, I'm happy to talk about more of my work that I do there. Bringing organizations together to make change, I think, is critical. But government being aligned to these systems is something I've spent a lot of time on too, that where government is often organized in ways that do not align to this kind of, not just the change process, but they're not even, you know, like something like food or energy is not even on the radar. And then education, place-based education as a means of not only students, not less so about kids learning about these things. It's more about kids experiencing these and actually getting involved in projects in their communities that will actually make a difference right away on the ground. They're part of the change effort. They're a huge resource, and it's a preferable way to learn for most of them. And then finally, you know, we can't leave our own identities and our own personal change of this. If we're not rowing in the same direction, it's very hard to make these systems change. It's very hard for politicians to make a stand if we're not kind of moving there with them. If we just say, well, we want you to fix it, we're not going to change anything ourselves, we know that's going to be hard. So I could share more, but I think that's probably good for now. So
Thank you, Matt. So I've got some questions, but I want to open it up to the community first. If people have questions, please come on camera, come off mute, and go ahead. And Aaron, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I thought the JFK example was really interesting. And in my experience, I've heard of cases in other cities where they built bike infrastructure, but they mainly think of it as something for recreation, and then that doesn't like grow into something that's actually used for utility. And so I thought it was really cool that in this example, it kind of like the JFK Promenade supported slow streets and helped, which sounds like it could be used more for utility. And I was curious if there's anything in particular about how JFK was operated that it was able to kind of change the like public perception of biking to support the slow streets.
right, yeah, I like that. To be honest, they were happening simultaneously in a lot of ways, and I think the pandemic created this huge opportunity, right? And I know some cities went back and they got rid of these kind of spaces. I would say that the fact that people were able to experience slow streets in their neighborhood, and they were also able to experience at the park, kind of like doubled it up. Like, oh, wow, streets really can change, not just here, but kind of everywhere. And then we're able to experience it, right? Okay, I can still get my car onto my street, and actually kind of like the fact that there aren't a lot of cars coming by that are speeding through my neighborhood, and you know, so people really grew accustomed to some of that, right? Not every street, but a lot of the streets, right? So the reason I only say I put JFK like as a stepping stone to slow streets is the political decision lever, right? So I think the momentum was there, and I think it had so much to do with the fact that people had this prolonged experience and appreciated it. It does help, of course, that we're in a city, and there's other ways to get around, but they're far from perfect. And so that just built when people saw that like 63% of voters supported this, it was like, okay, the whole political leadership was like, all right, we better get behind these kind of things. And so it was just like, and we kind of have to reboot. It's not like things have, you know, that means everything's fixed now. We still have a long ways to go. But it gave us a lot of momentum there. And yeah, I just think it's just playing with the idea of where did the power shift? The power definitely shift away from people, from car driving and all the force behind it, right? The culture changed, the land use changed. It was kind of all really important together, and it's super important that organizations work together to make it happen. So I think, to one more answer to your question, is the same groups and even more who were behind JFK were also behind Slow Streets, and they built a coalition there too. So it wasn't just one organization; it was a whole bunch saying, "We really want this," and got enough neighborhood support. There's always NIMBYism in all of these things, right? And there were a few Slow Streets that kind of didn't, either went away or got diminished quite a bit because of that, but that wasn't true everywhere.
Carrie, good to see you. What, you've got a question? Come on.
Thank you. Hi, good to see you. I have a million questions, so I was trying to narrow down like what's the most productive question for today's audience. Well, I suppose here's one for, that has gotten a lot of attention in both of our cities. And that is the question of housing and houselessness. And so I'm wondering, I know you obviously didn't have time to go through examples of that, but I've been wondering if you've done any work there. And, this challenge is facing both of our cities very profoundly, and there's lots of money being poured into trying to find the right solutions. And so I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to apply the framework in that context at all.
Sure, not directly. I certainly thought about it and written some in this book that I'm working on about it. Where are you, by the way? You're
Oh, sorry. I'm just assuming we're all here in Southern California, but I shouldn't do that. I'm in the greater Los Angeles area.
okay. Great. Yeah, sure. So I know it's it's statewide issue. I wish there was like a silver bullet. There's definitely I can't think of the name of it right now, but there's some, maybe you know it. There's some organization that's actually done a lot of work in some cities like Houston and a couple places where the number of homeless have gone way down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
yeah,
and they've certainly built up more collective will to make something happen. It's for us, and maybe true in LIT. It's so much of it, not all of it. There's so many dimensions to it, but definitely building more housing is around it. And what is encouraging in California is kind of the rise of California YIMBY and all the state laws that have changed. If you want to see more available, affordable housing for people in all the communities, but that's of course long term. It doesn't address homelessness right now on the street. But I feel like there's a definite power shift, and there's so many local chapters of YIMBY that really kind of help push on the ground change. And I think it's hard. It's super hard to implement this housing policy. San Francisco's got to add 82,000 housing units, and there's already quite a bit of resistance. But I feel, I don't know if there's a really good example yet, but I feel like if there's a YIMBY chapter, they've got to find ways to connect to some like the transportation groups I mentioned earlier, to other groups, maybe some cultural groups, community groups. Got to build that coalition. Otherwise, we're just never going to get there. And there's going to be resistance in so many places, right? So, yeah, I know. I certainly don't have good examples here in San Francisco. This thing I've studied more is just about available, affordable housing, less directly solving like homeless issues. But I believe that's the long-term thing.
Matt, we have just about 4 minutes left or so. And I'm wondering if you'd just take us through, you've been, had a pretty wide breadth of projects you've been involved in, but maybe just like a super short summary of the different types of projects that you've worked on might help provide inspiration.
Right. So the ones I'll focus on, we worked with a lot of organizations individually, but I've worked on about 12 collaboratives now. And some I helped build from the ground and facilitate for a while. And then someone, ideally becomes a director or coordinator of that. So the very first one really was San Francisco Children in Nature, right? And this is a lot of nonprofits, government agencies. Rec and Park is kind of the backbone of it. And on all three levels, they've changed the game, especially in early education, where nature experiences are a part of kids' education way more now. Preschools with lots of nature on their sites, or easy access to it. There's nature exploration areas that have been built up in parks. There's still a lot more to do, but they've and they've been tracking their metrics a lot on that. So that's a good one. One that's very place-based that is kind of near and dear to me is actually I've also done projects in Oklahoma. It's a long story. I won't go into how that happened, but it's a great experience to be living in these two different red-blue areas, so to speak. This was another nature project, actually, but much more than that. 130 some odd acres in the middle of the city, almost complete nature with a few historic buildings on it, historic Black neighborhoods surrounding it. I worked with, we kind of bridged community leaders with institutions there, and formed an alliance, and someone was able to acquire the property, actually a foundation in support of that vision. And that is now hopefully going to become a great community. It literally was a resource that was fenced off there's a big fence around the entire property, this beautiful park, and a disinvested community that had many things happen to them. This was yet another thing. And so that was, that's a powerful change, and it's powerful change around saying we value space for your community. We value space for nature nearby. Going back to transportation, you don't have to travel across town to get to a beautiful park. You can actually get to it here. I work on safe routes to school programs, and I mentioned that earlier, but what we specifically do, the workshop this morning, we just went through, this is probably the last example I'll use, David, is we have teams. It's a county-wide program, and we have 5 different city teams, and it's city with school district and school folks, maybe some county folks. There's all these teams, and they literally we just walked through designing a plan for a long term and the next 9 months, how they're going to shift power, how they're going to reset culture, and how they're going to transform land use in the sense of changing streets near their school to make this change. And this is the 3rd cohort. I keep pushing it to go bigger, because a lot of times, the street changes are kind of like, we'll bulb out curbs, make it safer for kids to cross. We'll put in protectors here and there. They're starting to get more into larger infrastructure. So those are a couple of them. But I really think what I found, and I don't expect those big ideas to be anything new to you at all. But what I hope I can suggest here is that these things really resonate with folks working on the ground. And when they can step back and not just be doing one thing after another, but say, oh, okay, I know power, culture, and land use dictates so much around what's going on in our world and how we live and the problems we have. How can I move those things? And importantly, not just doing one of them. It's like that's what we kind of suggest. If you just focus on land use, you're going to build it and no one's going to use it, right? If you just focus on culture, you're going to maybe have some interest, but people can't really actualize it, right? If you shift power, but there's no change in land or culture, it's like, well, nothing really happens. So I think and I hope that's helpful to all of you. It's the play with those ideas. There's no silver bullet. I don't claim to have the best framework, but I hope it's a useful one. So.
Thank you so much, Matt, and congratulations on your success. I hadn't heard about the slow streets at all. I love the concept, and I know that you got a lot of other successes and to tap into, and so many more questions about educating the public and getting people on board. But love the framework that you created, and thanks for stepping us through it. Also just want to thank some other people here and give people, Jesse and Aaron from Star Voting are going to be doing a presentation on Tuesday, the 27th. We're just getting the details together, and people are going to have a chance to participate in a mock Senate election. And Aaron will step us through how Star Voting works and why it kicks ass compared to ranked choice voting. And Kali, do you want to say, putting you on the spot, do you want to say a thing or two about the Just Economy Summit that's coming up in March?
Sure. And like Erin wanted to say something too. Yeah, so March 8th and 9th will be in Sacramento, and basically, yeah, coalition of folks that are interested in well-being economy, solidarity economy, that sort of thing. And it will be pretty open structured. So if you have ideas about the future of California's economy, you will be able to share your ideas, and we're hoping to kind of, I don't know, come to a consensus, or at least like find alignment and where these groups might want to come together and move forward.
And then a quick
And
other
it's free.
a quick plug for another partner. Poor People's Campaign of California is doing a rally in Sacramento on March 2nd to get people to show a collective show of power. It's happening at 32 state capitals all across the country on March 2nd. So if you're anywhere near Sacramento and want to go, let us know. We'll be happy. Or if you know people near Sacramento but want to try and make that a, and they're putting together a demands package, which I think is very aligned with what we're all talking about here today. And so really want to support that group. And there's a whole bunch of other events which we've run out of time to explain. So I put a link to them in the chat. And we just added 3 more that aren't even up on the website yet. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. And thanks everyone for coming. And Aaron, feel free to go ahead. But those who need to depart at the top of the hour, thank you for coming today, and thank you, Matt.
Yeah, for Matt, I just wanted to ask, so you said you're writing a book. I was curious if there is any way we can subscribe to an email list or something, or some way we could hear about the book when it's released.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, awesome. Just if you go to connectedtoplace.com, you can sign up for my post newsletter, and I put out my writings on that. So I'm just about to start a new series actually on living connected to place. It's kind of a precursor to the book. So I'd love to have any of you reading that. And I welcome your feedback too. Whatever would make this better, would make it resonate more, is really helpful.
Do you want to pop a link or an email in the? I've got the link I can put in. Okay. Yep.
Sure.
Aaron beat me to it. But yeah, any other? I'm happy to stay for overtime. Just want to make sure those who needed to leave at the top of the hour are able to go. So. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
And let's see how I stop recording.